One up on terror. U.S. leaders work to calm terror fears before their holiday breaks. Round two, prosecutors consider retrying a Baltimore police officer in connection with Freddie Gray's death. Candid conversation. Kentucky clerk Kim Davis discusses her brief meeting with Pope Francis in September. And happy birthday, Papa Francesco. Francis celebrates 79 today with cake and singing. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, December 17th, 2015. Good evening from Washington. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Brian Patrick with your news now. Speaking out about counterterrorism, President Obama says Americans need to remain vigilant. Chief White House correspondent and political director Lauren Ashburn reports tonight. Lauren?
Good afternoon. Good evening, Brian. Today, the president traveled across the Potomac River to the National Counterterrorism Center, and he addressed the troops there, saying that he wants them to thank them very much, He wants to thank them for doing such a good job for him. The president spoke to employees, and he also reiterated how the U.S. is attacking ISIS on three main fronts by stopping them in the Middle East, preventing them from getting into the U.S., and disrupting potential attacks. Yet he did have a message for the American people.
At this moment, our intelligence and counterterrorism professionals do not have any specific and credible information about an attack on the homeland. That said, we have to be vigilant.
The president leaves tomorrow for a 2-week vacation to Hawaii. He will stop in San Bernardino to comfort the families of the mass shooting, Brian.
All right, thank you, Lauren Ashburn. And investigators say the man who bought the assault rifles used in the San Bernardino attack will face federal charges. The suspects used the guns to kill 14 people at a holiday party. A husband and wife who had pledged allegiance to jihad later died in a shootout with police. Members of Congress want to know how one of those radicalized San Bernardino attackers slipped through the visa vetting process. Also, how do we stop other terrorists from entering the country? The House Oversight Committee today grills state and homeland security leaders on those points. One issue is how closely the U.S. examines the backgrounds of people asking to come into this country.
It is the threat that you may be polygraphed that sometimes provides people with the incentive to either tell the truth or they need not apply in the first place, right?
That can be one reaction from an individual, and I'm not aware, Mr. Gowdy, of any policy that would prevent that.
The director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services says there's a pilot program checking social media for thousands wanting to enter the U.S. Police in Oklahoma want to know what prompted a man to start shooting at cars on Interstate 40. One man was shot and killed as he and his wife traveled together near Hydro. Police say the gunman was randomly shooting at other drivers from his pickup truck. At least 4 cars were hit. The suspect did surrender this morning. 2 Indiana school districts canceled classes today after receiving threats. 2 students were arrested in Danville after allegedly making threats against schools in separate incidents. In Plainfield, near Indianapolis, students were told to stay home after a threat was directed to the high school. Meanwhile, students in Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Houston, and Dallas did go to school today. This after school officials in those cities say they received threats similar to those received in Los Angeles and New York earlier this week. Well, after a mistrial was declared in the first trial over Freddie Gray's death, lawyers on both sides meet today in the judges' chambers. They were expected to discuss dates for a possible retrial, but they said nothing as they left that meeting. The judge declared a mistrial in police officer William Porter's case after jurors reported a deadlock. Porter is one of 6 officers charged in Gray's death from a broken neck suffered in a police van in April. Baltimore has braced for a possible repeat of protests and destructions that engulfed that city in April. Other stories our EWTN News Nightly team is covering in today's world. The United States and Cuba reach an agreement to restore commercial flights between the two countries. This could open the way for U.S. airlines to begin flying to Cuba within months. Wyatt Goolsbee reports from Washington's Ronald Reagan National Airport.
Brian, this agreement could pave the way for the closest economic ties between Cuba and the United States since the two countries began normalizing relations exactly 2 years ago today. The U.S. State Department says the deal will allow 30 regularly scheduled flights a day, 20 to Havana and 10 to other Cuban cities. Right now, charter flights are the only way to fly between the U.S. and Cuba. American tourism, under the law, is still illegal. If an American wants to come to Cuba, he or she must be authorized. On this date last year, President Obama announced the reestablishment of diplomatic relations, the first in more than 50 years.
We will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead, we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries.
That same day, Cuba and the U.S. agreed to swap prisoners, which included the release of Alan Gross, an American contractor who spent 5 years in a Cuban prison. In July, both countries reopened embassies in each other's capitals. There are still many issues that divide the U.S. and Cuba. That includes billions of dollars in competing property claims, the status of fugitives in both countries, and accusations of human rights violations in Cuba. Brian?
All right, thank you. Frank Calzone is Executive Director of the Center for a Free Cuba, joining us tonight. Frank, what do you think Americans should know before they jump on a jet and go take a vacation or a business trip to Cuba?
They should know that despite the president's good intentions, human rights in Cuba are worse off today than when the president made his Cuba announcement a year ago.
You were behind this letter to the president, dated today, that calls his Cuba policy a regrettable mistake. Can you summarize this for us?
Well, the letter was signed by more than 100 former Cuban political prisoners, and they're asking the president to talk about the real Cuba, the Cuba that the Cubans suffer in Cuba. Talking about airplanes going to Cuba is fine, but what about the president focusing on Cuban women who go to church on Sundays and get beat up by Cuban security forces? What about asking the Cuban government to return American terrorists who live in Cuba and who kill American police officers in the United States?
You grew up there, you were an altar boy. What would convince you, Frank, that better relations between the U.S. and Cuba would eventually help the Cuban people?
Well, first of all, the president has to tell the truth. And the truth is that a lot of what you hear is not quite accurate. For example, the president says that his policy is a new policy. It's an old policy. It's the same old policy in which many American governments many years ago embraced dictators throughout Latin America. This is no different than the policy in the 1940s when American president embraced Trujillo in the Dominican Republic or other dictators who murdered their own people. The president has to acknowledge who Raul Castro is. Raul Castro is not a politician only. He's also a murderer. He has ordered the murder, for example, of Americans in the Florida Straits that were looking for refugees. The president returned to Cuba an American spy, a Cuban spy, who was involved in the planning of those murders. And apparently the president doesn't know who he is returning to Cuba or who he's allowing into the United States.
Pope Francis really set up this open dialogue between the U.S. and Cuba. He went to Cuba. Is it possible that Cuba might be a different Cuba than you remember from your childhood?
I'm not looking at the Cuba that I live with. I'm looking at the Cuba that is now. I'm a human rights activist. Hardly a day goes by that I don't get a call from Cuba from some woman crying saying they took away my son.
So you're very in touch with Cubans.
I am very in touch with him. I always encourage my friends, if they go to Cuba, they should go and talk to the nuns. They should go and try to help take soup, powder soup. Try to help the Cuban church, help the Cuban people. The president confuses Cuba and Cubans with the Castro dictator.
The Center for Free Cuba, Frank Calzone, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
Well, the defense secretary faces criticism now after admitting he used a personal email account to conduct government business. Ash Carter is being investigated by the Senate Armed Services Committee. Of course, the FBI is investigating Hillary Clinton for the private email server that she used as Secretary of State. House Speaker Paul Ryan promising a vote on defunding Planned Parenthood in the new year. Some Republicans don't want to wait that long, as Democrats are calling it a victory for them. Jason Calvi reports from the Capitol tonight.
Brian, 120 pro-life representatives sent a letter to Speaker Ryan urging him to include pro-life provisions in the budget. Today I was there when Speaker Ryan was asked why it wasn't part of the final compromise.
The Speaker says the House will take a separate vote on defunding Planned Parenthood and dismantling Obamacare after they return from their Christmas break.
It's in the reconciliation bill. The reconciliation bill was the vehicle we chose long ago. We could get that through the Senate. We knew we couldn't get it through the Senate in any other way.
Reconciliation allowed the defunding Planned Parenthood bill to pass through the Senate with only 51 votes, as opposed to the usual 60. But we're told Ryan did fight to include pro-life language in the budget deal.
That this was his top priority. He tried over and over and over again, and Obama himself made this a non-negotiable.
And today, Nancy Pelosi also pulled the curtain back on the secret budget negotiations, saying Democrats won on the abortion issue.
We blocked 10 riders in the bill that would have seriously hurt organized labor in our country. Really stunning how they have targeted, whether it's women's health and Planned Parenthood.
Some conservative Republicans are expected to vote against the spending bill because it doesn't defund Planned Parenthood or block Syrian refugees from entering the country. Some Democrats may also vote against the spending bill because it allows exports of crude oil.
The final vote is scheduled tomorrow. Brian?
Jason Calvi at the Capitol. Thank you, Jason. Today, December 17th, is Pope Francis's birthday. He's celebrating. The Holy Father presented with a birthday cake in the Vatican today. He's 79, but he blew out just a single candle. Coming up, Kentucky clerk Kim Davis sits down with our Catherine Zeltner, sharing her experience of meeting Pope Francis. Oh, heavenly wisdom, hear our cry, great everlasting Son, who with the Father, God Most High, are now and ever one. Today's O Antiphon for this Thursday in the third week of Advent. We have one for each day up until the 23rd. I'm Brian Patrick. Thanks for being with us tonight. The date is now set for New Hampshire's first in the nation presidential primary. Voters will go to the polls February 9th. That's just 8 days after the lead-off Iowa caucuses. Now, in past years, other states have jockeyed to move their primaries and caucuses earlier, hoping to share some of that political spotlight. Star Parker is the founder and president of CURE, the Center for Urban Renewal and Education. You just returned from the GOP debate in Las Vegas. Tell us what your thoughts are in terms of how the debate went and whether the candidates changed your mind in any way.
Well, I'm following most of these candidates, but I have to tell you, Brian, I went into Las Vegas coming from Italy. I was there when the doors were opened for the year of Jubilee of Mercy.
The Holy Door.
The Holy Door and Mercy. And so getting to the GOP debates, to come in from that excitement that was there in Roma a week or so ago, to then come to the GOP debate, it more focused on what's at stake for this country and for the world. And so this particular debate, I think, spotlit why it is so important that we have these debates. The Republican Party is in chaos. Their pillars are pretty volatile. The traditional values people don't know which candidate to believe. The limited government Tea Party people don't trust any of them. The free market libertarian element is, pretty much upsetting the apple cart 100%. And then you have those that are traditional establishment candidates that are engaged in this momentum to go to war. And so it was very visible at this debate that the candidates are getting closer to clarifying who they are and what it is that they believe, and the voters are starting to sense that we need something more substantive.
Pretty messy, the way you describe it.
It was messy inside. There were hecklers, there were boos, there was energy inside, there were those that had picked their candidate and were going to be adamant to make sure that no other candidate was heard in the audience itself. That the TV was able to screen out a little bit. But the one upside was that it stayed on topic. And the topic was terrorism, the topic was immigration, the topic was what role does America play in the world. And I think that some of the candidates shined a little bit more than others for what they believe.
We're specifically interested in moral issues, life, marriage, religious freedom, and the lines are very clearly drawn between Republican and Democrat on this. But who in this pack of GOP candidates is the strongest on these issues?
Well, on the big stage, you have Ted Cruz, who we know is going to be consistent. There's just no way that he is going to deviate from who he is as a Christian and especially with his dad, he'll make sure that he doesn't. You have on the big stage as a consistent Christian, Jeb Bush. We would know where he stood, and I think that people see the consistency in his record. The challenge that we have this particular time is we have a lot of folks who have never held political office, so they're not on record. They can tell us things, but there's no real record to show that they are going to long-term hold out for. That is not core. It's not in their worldview. So that means that there's going to be a whole lot more lobbying efforts just to get simple things done, like defunding Planned Parenthood. There are some that are concerned about Marco Rubio and some of his supporters on issues of marriage, because if you have big billionaire donors who marriage to them includes homosexuals, then what is that pressure going to be if he were in the White House? So those questions are legitimate that Christian Catholics are asking, and make sure that they're listening very attentively to get the right answers that they need to stand before God when they go into that voting booth.
I'm really curious, coming from that beautiful ceremony of the Holy Door opening
I know.
to this stage, literally a stage in Las Vegas.
I know.
That had to have been culture shock for you.
It was culture shock, but I tell you, to see the cardinals and the bishops and just it's brilliant. And one of the things it did personally is it keeps this stuff in focus. And especially as you go to the Vatican and you see the big world and the church inside of it, it keeps it in focus. And so I was looking for particulars at the debate. There, as a media commentator, and it helped me know that we've got to do our job to inform the public and the voters, and it helped me know that they need to understand what's at stake in this next election.
Well, thank you for sharing your unique experience with us on EWTN. Star, it's great to see you again.
Thank you.
Star Parker. Well, in an exclusive sit-down interview, EWTN News Nightly's Catherine Zeltner talks with the county clerk who gained international attention for refusing to license marriage, or issue marriage licenses, rather, to same-sex couples.
Brian, I sat down with Kim Davis yesterday in her hometown of Moorhead, Kentucky. She opened up about her meeting with Pope Francis during his U.S. visit. Take us there to the Vatican Embassy. What was it like to be there?
The Pope walks in and he holds out his hand, so I shake his hand and then I pull him in and give him a hug, a one-armed hug, and he hugged me back. And then we broke away and he was standing, he said, "I want to thank you for your courage and ask you to pray for me." So he still had his hands out like this, and I took his hands in my hands, and his hands are so soft. I took his hands in my hands, and I said, "I will pray for you, and I ask you to pray for me." And he grinned, he spoke to me in English, and very heavily accented English, but it was, his accent was beautiful, I think. And he presented my husband and I with a rosary. He said, "Stay strong," told me to stay strong. And then they turned and they left.
Why do you think it was important to share that meeting?
The stand I took affects every church, every person that lives and loves God, that holds the Word of God precious and dear and intimate in their lives. I'm just the first of what's going to be very many. You can rest assured of that. And it's not if it happens, it'll be when it happens. And maybe my stand will encourage others who will be in the same position.
Kim Davis gave the 2 rosaries from Pope Francis to her parents who are practicing Catholics. Davis also opened up about her 6 days in jail, calling it a joyful and peaceful time.
Would she do it again if she had to?
She said she would and knows that it is a possibility.
Thank you, Catherine Zeltner. Up next, Lauren Ashburn details the new initiative, Know Your Neighbor, from the White House. And EWTN's Joan Lewis takes her love for the Holy Land to a whole new level. Happy 79th birthday today to Pope Francis, born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Buenos Aires, Argentina, December 17, 1936, the eldest of 5 children of Italian immigrants. Thanks for joining us this Thursday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. A new multi-faith initiative is being launched today at the White House. It's called Know Your Neighbor. Chief White House correspondent Lauren Ashburn is with the program's founder tonight.
Brian, joining me right now is the executive director of the Baptist Joint Committee. His name is Brent Walker. And Brent was here, one of 15 groups at the White House, to launch a program called Know Your Neighbor. Tell me about Know Your Neighbor.
Know Your Neighbor is a wonderful project that was formed to bring together people from across the religious and political spectrum to covenant with one another, to get to know one another, and to get to know our neighbors. Not just the people in the group, but to reach out to know the other person. This country has such wonderful, plush religious pluralism, along with the religious freedom that we enjoy, and we really need to take responsibility for continuing that, ensuring it, and as long as we're ignorant about other religions, as long as we don't know other folks, as long as we're fearful, that's going to poison our politics, and it's going to make our culture something than it ought to be.
Tell me why it's important right now at this time when we've just experienced a terrorism attack.
Absolutely, and just pick up your morning paper or check your Facebook page or your Twitter feed. It's all over the place. There's fear, there's anger, there's ignorance, and we need to counter that.
What are your specific objectives? What would you like this program to do?
I would like for us to be able not just to know our neighbors, but to be neighbors and to love our neighbors and to reach out to them in a way that is going to be beneficial to all of us and to our country. We can't rely on government alone to take care of that task. It's got to be a citizens' initiative that we need to take. People of faith and there are people of no faith in this group that understand the importance of the pluralism that is this country's great and wonderful characteristic.
Very good. Brent, thank you so much for joining us here at the White House.
All right. Thank you, Lauren. And EWTN Rome Bureau Chief Joan Lewis has been named a lady in the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre. Her ceremony of investiture is this weekend. Joan is joining us from Rome. Congratulations on your well-deserved honor, Joan.
Well, thank you so much. I am honored and humbled.
Give us a brief snapshot of the work that the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre do.
Well, actually, protection of the Holy Sepulchre is on the first order of business and has been for well over 900 years. And all of the activities in the Holy Land, it's helping Christians survive. It is helping to build, maintain hospitals, schools, orphanages, anything that we can do to help Christians who are an ever-diminishing presence in the Holy Land, unfortunately.
And what does this honor mean to you personally, Joan?
Well, personally, knowing that I love the Holy Land, I've been trying to support, like Bethlehem University, for example. I've been trying to support for years many of the same work that the Order is doing in the Holy Land. And so when I was invited to join the Order, I was honored beyond telling. But you know what? It's not just an honor. It's a duty, and it's a privilege. So you'll be reading about it. I'll be writing about it, and they'll be covering the ceremony so you can learn more.
I can't wait. Joan Lewis, Rome Bureau Chief for EWTN. Thank you, and again, congratulations.
Thank you.
It's great to see Joan there in Rome. Until tomorrow, for the EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Brian Patrick. We say goodnight with special moments for Pope Francis this past year on today, his 79th birthday.